This video is going to walk through task 1 of the edTPA for early childhood, and this is focused on the planning commentary. And what I'm going to do is walk through the prompts that you have to write to in this task, as well as the rubric level progressions and how to score at a level 3 for all of the rubrics. And then I am also going to, just getting organized, talk really briefly about the types of lesson plans that you can design and ways to make sure that you're successful on this planning commentary. All of those things connected. So to start, they ask you to talk about a central focus. This central focus is not explicitly addressed in the rubric, and in fact, the rubrics for the edTPA are holistic. And what that means is that you're not going to see a direct one-to-one map from the planning commentary over to the rubric. So the rubrics are really meant to take a holistic look at what you've designed and what you've written, covering an essential question that's found at the top of each section of the Understanding Rubric Level Progressions document for each rubric. So rubric 1 is about how your plans build on each other to support the children's language and literacy development through active and multimodal learning. And so after defining what all of those terms mean, it tells you in the beige colored box what prompt you're going to be addressing this in. And so this rubric is addressed in your responses to all of the sections of question 1. So everything you write for question 1 goes into this rubric. So even though these questions are super specific, the rubrics are written generally and holistically to span multiple questions and multiple prompts within questions. So for question number 1, they want you to describe a central focus and a purpose of the content that you're going to teach in your learning segment. At the early childhood level, this can be really the kind of like the focus of your unit plan, if you will. And you might have something like participating in a discussion about a text, or language skills, vocabulary related to the seasons, or if you're teaching at one of the upper grades, maybe you're having your students do a writing central focus. So it could be something like descriptive words in writing narrative passages or something like that. So this is a pretty easy one. You're just going to talk about what the content is. And then the purpose of the content should connect out to something focused on literacy. So what's the purpose, language and literacy, of that content, of that central focus? Okay, so that one, again, does not map out directly to anything on the rubric, but it does set the tone for the rest of what you're writing. And this can be very brief. Just a couple of sentences will suffice. Question B, describe how the standards and learning objectives for your segment support children's two different things: active and multimodal learning, language and literacy development in an interdisciplinary context. This is the hardest question in the entire commentary because it's multi-part and there's lots of different sub-parts that you need to address. This question needs to start with a clear statement of your standards and learning objectives. So this one should start with something like, the standards I selected for these lessons is, and then clearly state the standards. And you should be talking interdisciplinarily here. So both your literacy standards and your science or math or social studies or technology or whatever standards you're using, list all of them here. And then list them. And then right after that, you're going to put the learning objectives I designed for each lesson are, and then you're going to list your learning objectives. So that's how this section needs to start. Then you need to start talking across the different things across your lessons and how they are supporting, how your standards and objectives support your students' development in these two areas. So I suggest breaking this up into active and multimodal here, and then language and literacy development here, and then even adding another sentence for the interdisciplinary context here. So you've got to hit all of these things, and my suggestion for this is to organize this into sections that are super clear. You can even have paragraphs, but you've got to hit all of these things. And you're not talking about how your plans build and on each other to support them in this. You're really talking about how active and multimodal learning happening related to your objectives and standards. So keep it super focused on how the standards are supporting them in active and multimodal learning, how the objectives are supporting them in active and multimodal learning. Same thing with this. Language and literacy development happening related to your objectives and standards. So this, for example, could sound something like this. So let's say that you're teaching that early childhood lesson where the central focus is writing a narrative, using descriptive language. So active and multimodal learning that's happening related to that, to those objectives and standards, might be the standard I selected was a writing standard about using descriptive language, and I had the students be active and multimodal in that learning in lesson 2, where my objective was that students would play a game that matched the descriptive words to one of the 5 senses that they had learned previously, and they got to get up and play an active game that allowed them to engage physically. And then multimodal might be, and later I asked in lesson 3, I asked the students to help me with a shared writing experience where I was modeling for them how writing would sound from an adult, and then or from a fluent writer, and then they got to then do that later in their lesson on their own in independent writing, so that the multiple modes are shared writing versus independent writing. The active is that game where they're physically moving. So those are just a couple of examples. And then language and literacy development happening related to your objectives and standards would be the same sort of thing, but talking about how your standard you selected is about writing narrative text with description, and you would quote the standard, and they're doing this in appropriate ways related to language and literacy development when they in lesson 1, for example, the objective is insert the objective, and the students start the lesson with some vocabulary foundational work, and that helps them with the language that they need for developing in that area. Okay, so this is a very complicated response. And then also across all of it, really, you need to weave in that interdisciplinary context. And this is an easy one, and this is only related to standards and objectives. And this one's pretty easy because you have to design an interdisciplinary set of lessons. So simply say how you are working in the science or the social studies or whatever other content area you're focusing on. So this response can be a bit lengthy, but you've got to do a lot of things in it. Okay, so the next question is explain how your plans build on each other to support children's language and literacy development through active and multimodal learning. So this one truly is a step-by-step description of each lesson, each day, and how you are engaging your students in active. So that's one thing. Multimodal, that's another thing. Learning in language, that's one thing. And literacy development, that's another thing. So if you think about this, you're going to go one by one through your lessons and saying things like, in lesson 1, students are active and multimodal when they, and then explain, and then they are supported in their language and literacy development when they, and insert the thing. And then you're going to do the same thing in lesson 2. Students are active and multimodal when they, and you're going to go lesson by lesson, explaining how your students are doing all of these things. So each lesson gets its own little subsection here in this response. And in that, you're going to explain how your plans build on one another and do all of the things that they're looking for in this early childhood edTPA. So that one's pretty straightforward and clear. You just need to make sure you structure it in a way that is organized and clear and talks about all of the things that you're doing. Part D is describe how the physical environment in which you are teaching supports the active and multimodal nature of children's learning. And if in your view it doesn't, like say you're in a space that you have no control over because you're not the full-time teacher, you should describe the changes that you would make. So this is really where you talk about the physical classroom. And when you're focusing on active and multimodal, you need to talk about things like the different areas of the room. Is there a rug for sitting? Are there tables? Are there tables at the student's height? Are there comfy reading corners? Is there manipulatives? Is there a smartboard for music or videos or other media? Is there a classroom library? All of these things would help your students to be active and multimodal. So list off the things that are active and multimodal about the physical environment. And then you also supports the active multimodal nature of children's learning. If there's any changes that you would make, you list them here if you're in a space that doesn't have those things going on. So anything that helps the children to be active and multimodal. Okay, so once you do that, you can go out to rubric 1 and see that at a level 3, your plans are logically sequenced to facilitate the children's learning. And you could see that one maps, part of it maps out specifically to this part C, and also a little bit to the part about the standards and the objectives. So if you nail part C, you're going to be okay. You're going to be at a level 3. This next bullet under the level 3 says that your plans are presented in a linear sequence, or if it's nonlinear, each learning experience builds on the previous one. So again, it's really focused on this part C, how your plans build. You got to nail that part. In addition, the sequencing of the plan supports children's learning by connecting the multiple modes of learning with the active nature of young children. These connections are explicitly written into the plans or the commentary, and how the connections are made is not left to the determination of the scorer. So, for example, the candidate specifically identifies the multiple modalities of learning and opportunities for active learning. That is all about this one and a little bit about this one. So you really got to have part C be quite extensive. You can see how much of the rubric is relying on part C. And then it says, be sure to pay attention to each component of the early childhood emphasis on the active and multimodal nature of young children's learning. Okay, so you've got to get your part C in order. And then to get an auto 1, you've got some misalignment somewhere in your lesson plans or your standards or objectives. So just make sure everything is aligned. You don't have a random standard or objective on there that you're not actually going to address. I'm just going to take a quick scan of above a level 3. The candidate provides explanations of how the planned experiences facilitate active learning in young children, and they relate to the planned learning segment. This one seems pretty easy to get a 4 on. So not only are you explaining, but they relate directly to your planned learning segment. So it's all about part C for this first one. Okay, so I'm going to move on to rubric 2, which is planning to support the varied learning needs of the students, how you use your knowledge of the children to support their varied learning needs. And rubrics 2 and 3 are both on prompts 2 and 3, and it's not that rubric 2 is related to prompt 2 and 3 is related to 3. In fact, if anything, they're the reverse order. 2 is related to rubric 3 and vice versa, but they really are a mix of both. So rubric 3 is your knowledge of children to inform teaching and learning. How do you use knowledge of the children to justify your instructional plans? So I think this one is helpful to go through all of 2 and 3 and see what they're asking, and then come back to the rubric and see what they're scoring you specifically on. So for question 2, knowledge of children to inform your teaching, you're going to describe what you know about the children in your class or your small group that you taught to with respect to your central focus. And here, whenever you see this beige colored box and it says children with IEPs or 504s, this is where you must talk about the students from your context for learning who have IEPs or 504s. You are legally bound to speak about those children's needs whenever you have this box. And then any English language learners that you put in your context for learning, any children at the different points of developmental continuum, struggling readers, underperforming children, gifted children, anyone you put in your context for learning needs to be addressed in this question. So, part A, children's development. What do you know about the children's social and emotional development, cognitive and physical, language development for communication? I would literally break this down into those 3 parts and simply state what you know about all of those areas. If those are things that you're unclear about, you might want to quickly look them up. Just do a quick Google search about children's social and emotional development. This is things like regulating their behavior and being able to follow rules and routines in a classroom, and respecting the other students around them and regulating their emotions, things like that, and being developmentally appropriate. So what a pre-K student should be able to do there looks different from what a second grade student can do there. Then we got their cognitive and physical development. What do you know about the way that their minds work and the way that they think at that grade level? And what is going to be developmentally appropriate for them in an academic sense, and how do you know that? And then their physical development. You have to talk a lot about their active and multimodal abilities in this set of lessons and in this commentary. So you need to know something about their physical development. Are they able to get up and dance in an organized way? And is that appropriate for them? And how do you know? So you're going to talk about that. And then their language development for communication is all about like the vocabulary they use. They're expressive, that's what they can listen to and understand. And they're receptive, that's what they can, sorry, I had it backwards. Receptive is what they can listen to and understand, and expressive is the vocabulary that they can use on their own to express themselves. And then also maybe you want to talk here about their written and their reading vocabularies here. So they've got 4 different kinds of vocabularies you could talk about. The expressive, the receptive, and then the written and the reading vocabulary. Those are all different forms of language development for communication that we all possess and use, and you can talk about those in your students and your individual students. And here you would want to mention any students who have differences in development in all of these areas. So that goes into part A, and that goes into your knowledge of the students, which is actually related to rubric 3. So this is where you establish a foundation of knowledge that you have for them. Okay. Part B, personal, cultural, and community assets. What do you know about your children's everyday experiences, cultural and language backgrounds and practices, and their interests? So this is what happens when they leave your classroom, and how do you know this? So if you have anyone who speaks language other than English at home, you would talk about them and how you communicate maybe with them and the families, anything that you've learned about their everyday experiences in their community. If you have students who you know, for example, visit the community library very frequently and they often check out books, or they have parents who are very engaged and involved and show up for school events, you would talk about that. If you have students who you know celebrate different holidays in your classroom and they have different language practices. Do they speak African American vernacular at home, or do they speak a different dialect of English? And then this one is kind of the low-hanging fruit. You should always talk about interests. So what do you know about your children's interests? And it would be really good if this aligned to the planning that you're doing. So I know, for example, when I designed my science and writing unit, I know that my students were really interested when we talked about the 5 senses. So I'm going to work that into the planning that I do for them. So you would mention their interests in the science concept that you had previously taught. Okay, so that's part B. That's purely descriptive. Part C is their prior learning and prerequisite skills that are related to their language and literacy development. So what do you know about what your students can already do? So this is a multi-part question, and what they are learning to do related to their language and literacy development. So this one needs to be structured clearly. In terms of language and literacy development, my students can already, and you would fill in what they can do related to your lesson. So if you're teaching them about those descriptive words in their writing, then you would want to talk about the other kinds of prior writing that they've done and those prerequisite skills that you know of. So previously they learned how to write complete sentences, or previously they learned how to write narratives, and now we're going to go back in with descriptive language, we're going to build on that to teach them the next skill in that sequence. And then also here, my students are learning to. So this one is prior knowledge. So in terms of language and literacy development, my students can already, this is prior knowledge. My students are learning to is where you're going. So this would be all about how you know that they're ready. So this is really like readiness for your lessons. How do you know that they're ready? And what's important is what comes here, and this is what sets you apart in the rubric. You need to cite evidence from your knowledge of this class or this group of children. So it's not only that my students can already do this, I know this because of the evidence from the previous unit on blah, blah, blah. So you need to cite some evidence of their learning. So let's say you gave the previous unit was on writing a paragraph, because I know my students in the previous unit were all able to pass the unit final test and write a full paragraph. That could be just one example. And then my students are learning to, how do you know that they're ready for your lessons? Also here, cite some evidence that tells you this. And this is all related to their language and literacy development. How do you know that they're ready for your lessons? And you're going to connect this to their prior knowledge and what you see them currently able to do. Okay. Oops. Then that's question 2. And if you look at rubric 3, the candidate explains how the learning tasks are explicitly connected to the children's prior academic knowledge or their knowledge of the children's assets. So this explains how your tasks are connected. So now all you've done in question 2 is set up what you know about the students. So now in question 3, you're actually going to start to justify and describe the planning that you've done. So in number 3, to support your justifications, refer to your plans and materials that you included as part of your planning task 1. So you're actually going to cite your lesson plans here. And in addition, use principles from research or theory to support your justifications. So part A, justify how your planned learning experiences and materials align with your understanding of the children's development, of their prior learning, and of their personal and community, cultural and community assets from that you just listed above. Be explicit about these connections and support your justification with research and theory. Okay, so this one is multi-parted. Justify how your plans align with your understanding of these 3 things. So this would sound like my planned learning experiences and materials align with my understanding of children's development by, and here's where you're going to talk about what you know about their development levels. And you've already talked about that. You've already talked about that up here in the children's development. So now this is where you told me about your students. What is their social and emotional, cognitive and physical and language development? So you already described your kiddos, already talking about your IEPs. Now explain how you aligned your teaching to that. here is a good place to work in some theory. And so find a developmental theorist. Think of like Piaget or Bruner, one of those people, and mention how this relates to your planning for your students. So for example, you're going to talk here about how I know that my children developmentally are ready for the here if you talked about language development and if you spoke about your children's development of their receptive vocabulary and connecting that to their expressive vocabulary, and they have a growing vocabulary in science, and we've talked about the 5 senses, I'm going to build on that, and I know that they're developmentally ready for that in my learning experiences, and I've done that by planning lessons that expose them more deeply to a special kind of sense language, and that's the descriptive words that they're writing about in their writing samples that they're submitting to me. And then you could connect that out to theory by explaining how you're meeting them at their exact point of need, which is also known as their zone of proximal development, and how this relates to Vygotsky's theory of social cultural learning, or Bruner's theory of stages or phases. Any one of the theorists would work. So find a developmental theorist and mention how it relates to your planning for your students. Okay, so once you do that, you're not done. You need to then, my planned learning experiences and materials align with my understanding of the children's prior learning, which is the next thing in the sequence here, by, and how does it connect to their prior learning? So up here you talked about what their prior learning is, right here in part C. You know what they can do, you know what they're learning to do. So now you're going to make that explicit connection to why you planned your lessons the way that you did. So you know that they're able to do X, Y, and Z thing in their writing, and now you're going to connect because that's where you're going to pick up with your lesson. You should talk about how you know what they can do and that you are using this to pick up right where they left off academically. This is where your lesson plans come in. Okay. And then be specific about your lessons and the ways that you're connecting to their prior knowledge. Okay, so that's your prior knowledge. So you've got children's development here. You've got prior learning here. And then you've got one more thing you need to do. My planned learning experiences and materials align with my understanding of the children's personal, cultural, and community assets by. So you should talk about what you know about your students' home lives, language experiences, personal backgrounds, cultures, interests, etc. So everything about their backgrounds as it relates to your planning. So edTPAs that do really well have deeply considered the students in the class and developed lessons that are appropriate to them. Worst case scenario, you'd focus just on their interests. So I know that the students enjoy reading texts written by this specific author. So I've continued to use text by that author in the text that I chose in this unit, where I know that the students have an interest in the five senses, because we've already learned that in science. So I'm connecting to the five senses in their descriptive words for this writing lesson. So somehow connect at the very least to their interests. A way you can connect to their personal backgrounds is if you allow them moments to share things about their personal lives. So if you ask them to tell you a story at any point and they get to talk about their families or something that happened at home, or if you have, those authentic moments where students get to connect personally. This works well in writing pieces because often they're going to bring in their personal backgrounds to the writing that they do. So any point that you allow them to talk about themselves, their home lives, their personal interests, you are doing this. But you need to talk very intentionally about specific places in your lessons where this is happening. And here's a pro edTPA tip. If this happened in your lesson spontaneously, go back and write it into your lesson plan as if it wasn't spontaneous, but rather a planned thing. So if you ask the students in your lesson to tell you a personal story, or they just start sharing personal stories, write it into your plans that you have a moment to stop and share personal stories. Then you can say, oh, in lesson 2, the students were asked to share personal stories. See day 2. And then you can say that you planned for it in your lessons. Okay, so making sure that we hit everything. You don't have to have research and theory for every one of these, but it's not bad to have it for a couple of them. And here is a good place to cite research into culturally responsive teaching, or something along those lines of allowing your students' cultures to come into play in the classroom. Okay, so that is question 3. Make sure you're citing some research there and some theory. Never a bad idea to have one of each. And then down here in part B, it says, describe and justify how you plan to support the varied learning needs of all the children in your class or group, including individuals with specific learning needs. So this is actually a hidden 4-part question. 2 parts, describe and justify. 2 parts, whole class and individuals. So, and this is one of those ones where you have to talk about how you're addressing the needs of children with IEPs and 504s. So the best way to structure this is by the whole class and the individual students. So I planned to support the varied learning needs of all children in the group by, and then you would describe how you did this in your plans. And then I planned this way because, and then here is where you justify why you planned this way. And this is talking about the whole class here. So ways that you can support the varied needs of everybody in your class. This can include things like modeling if you do a shared reading or a shared writing. Sorry. So including things like modeling, shared writing, shared reading, a read aloud, think aloud to share your cognitive thoughts. So like my brain does this when I'm reading and I know I'm going to do this. Pre-teaching vocabulary words to everyone. Starting with your lesson goals or objectives and clearly stating them. All of the things, I could go on and on with this list, but these are all the good things, basically, all the good things you've learned about lesson planning that is sensitive to all learners. So this is like the universal design stuff. The ways that you've learned to really plan good lessons to meet everybody's needs. That's in the first paragraph. Okay, so then the second paragraph is going to be set up in exactly the same manner, but up here we were talking about all children in the group, and down here we're going to be talking about these individuals with specific learning needs. So I plan to support the specific learning needs of individual students by, and so describe how you did this in your plans. You need to talk about individual students from your context for learning. So here is where you'll say things like, I have students who are learning English as a new language, and so I pre-taught the vocabulary words. I have students who are struggling readers, and so I read aloud the text to them individually when we had small group time. All of the ways, justify why you plan this way for individual students. These include things like your modifications or accommodations. That is not how you spell that. For specific students. You must talk about IEPs and 504 plans here. And if you don't, you get an automatic 1. So this needs to be structured super clearly in this way. So I planned for the learning needs of all children up here, describe them first and then justify your plans, talk about all the good things you've learned about universal design. If you want to be extra, you can put a citation in there. And then down here, I plan to support the learning needs of individuals by, and here's where you talk about your differentiation. Talk about differentiation for individual students from your context for learning, and then justify why you plan this way and include things like your modifications or your accommodations. You have to talk about your IEPs here. Okay, so that response is so important. This is really a make or break response for both rubrics 2 and 3. So make sure it's solid. And you can see that you explain how the tasks are explicitly connected to prior knowledge and assets. Here's where the research and theory, this one is actually related to this response up here. So how your plan experiences align with their prior learning. So this one is all rubric 3. Rubric 3 directly relates to what you write in 3A. So this is rubric 3. And so you need to talk about their prior academic knowledge or their assets to get a 3. And guess what happens at a level 4? You talk about their prior knowledge and their assets. So if you and those two things, if you've got prior knowledge and their assets, you could get a level 4. This is a really easy one to get a level 4, and you do that here. Okay, so then I'm going to go back to rubric 2 to talk about how that connects. The last question here is on rubric 2. It says, describe common developmental approximations or misunderstandings that pertain to the learning experiences that you're planning for the children and how you plan to address them. This, for example, common beginning or transitional language errors or other attempts to use skills or processes just beyond their current level. So this is really, what do the students not yet understand that could be confusing for them in your lessons? So for example, you're going to give an example. Let's say that you are teaching descriptive language and you're asking them to think about how their 5 senses help them with the descriptive language, and they don't fully understand how the sense of touch relates to a word like sticky. That's kind of a really sophisticated cognitive leap for them to have to take. Whereas I think a word like boom or crashing, that's a pretty easy leap. Like, you can almost like hear that boom sounds loud. Whereas like if something is purple, that's a little bit harder to connect out to sight, for example, than other words. Another possibility here is if you're talking about words that connect to sight and you say something like sight words, your students might know, just for an example, your students might know sight words as a different thing. Literally the sight words that they need to know in 2nd grade, like the, and, because, said. Those are sight words, and they might get a little bit confused between the two, for example. So you need to talk about the things that could potentially be confusing and how you plan to address those confusions. So talk about how you plan to address those confusions. Okay. And then you can see how this connects to rubric 2. It says, you explain how the plan supports for children address the learning needs of the whole class or the group. That is this ridiculous question where you're talking about the whole class or the group. And then at least one of the requirements from IEPs in your context for learning, and that's going to be your individual students down here talking about the IEPs. And then it says requirements must be explicitly addressed in the commentary and or in the planning task 1 artifacts. So make sure that if you are differentiating for your IEPs and 504s, that is also shown in the instructional materials that you provide. Like, how did you show that you differentiated in your lesson plans? A list of the requirements or the accommodations in your context for learning is not sufficient. You have to also talk about it explicitly here. And that's getting at that requirement to meet the IEPs and 504s. So did you plan for it in your lesson plan, and then did you talk about it here explicitly? So above a level 3 on this one, you're providing an explanation of how the supports are tied to the learning objectives and are intended to meet the specific needs of individuals or groups of children with similar needs in addition to the whole class. So that would be your groups down here. and talking maybe about students who struggle to read or write. And differentiated support should be provided for more than one child, either more than one individual or for a specific group of children with similar needs. So this one, going back up to here for just a second, I noticed that a difference here seems to be learning needs of children whole group. So this one, the difference between a level 3 and 4 seems to be in how you're addressing other than the whole group. So here you address the whole group and then you talk about only the things you have to from your context for learning. And here you're actually talking about supporting more than one child or individual from a specific group. You're talking about like multiple kinds of groups of children who need additional supports beyond those required required in an IEP in 504. Okay, moving on. So that's question 3 and how you can score on rubrics 2 and 3. Rubric 4 is language development. How do you identify and support children's vocabulary development? So the early childhood edTPA is all focused on vocabulary. So you need to show multiple points in your plans where you are teaching them vocabulary words. At a level 3, you have general support to promote the children's development of the vocab. It's described, but you don't go into super detail. And then you identify vocabulary related to the central focus and the planned learning experience. And that's the secondary criterion. And even if you have the secondary, but you don't have the primary solid, you'll never get more than a 3. This one, let's see, a level 4. Your supports are differentiated to address some specific children's understanding and planned use of vocab, and you identify vocabulary related to the central focus and identified learning experience. So you plan specific vocabulary supports in relation to children's language needs to engage these children in the learning experience. So explicitly and specifically teaching them vocabulary supports. And then you describe how your supports are specific for some children in the whole class or the group. If you describe your supports in detail but not how they are related, you won't get a 4. So describe the supports in detail and how the supports are related to the specific needs of children in the whole group. Okay. I fully understand. So respond to prompts 4A through C below by referring to children's range of vocabulary development related to the learning segment. What do they know? What are they struggling with? What is new to them? So step 1 is identify the key vocabulary, developmentally appropriate sounds, words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs. So depending on what age range you're in, you can choose from those, essential for the children to use during this segment. So this would be key vocabulary, words from the text, definitions of what is being taught. So if you're teaching them a strategy, you're going to define those. If you're focusing on descriptive words, you're going to talk about what descriptive means, and you're going to refer to that over and over again and have specific examples for the children. If you have, this would be a good place for the content area vocabulary, and literally you are listing some of these vocabulary words. So you're not just going to say key vocabulary words from the text. You're going to put, for example, slippery, boom, gigantic. So you're going to put a bunch of exact examples definitions of what's being taught, so you'll actually literally include them. And then content area vocabulary, so if you're working on the 5 senses, touch, sight, etc., you can list those out. So these are the actual words and the vocab that you're going to teach them that are essential for them to use during the learning segment. And then part B is identify the learning experience that provides children with the opportunities to develop, practice, and use the key vocabulary. So this is talking about one moment in your lesson plan. So let's say you have a key moment where you get to really engage the children in some vocabulary work. So I keep talking about that sample of teaching them good descriptive language. Describe a key moment in your lessons. So let's say you're doing like lesson 2, where children get to engage with vocabulary. And we're talking here about how they can explain how they do 3 things: develop, practice, and use the key vocabulary in that lesson. So this would sound like, in lesson 2, I had students do blank with vocabulary words, and fill in the blank. So be super specific. So if you're teaching them, they get to play a game where they're going to sort the 5 senses descriptive words into the senses that they belong to. If you're going to do that, you would explain in lesson 2, I had the students practice descriptive words related to the senses of sight and sound, and they had to say the word, describe what the word was, and then physically get up and put the word in the correct sight area of descriptive language. And they had to recite the word, they had to explain what it was, so they got practice in that vocabulary, and then they had to say out loud if it was a sight or a sound word, and they also got to practice the senses vocabulary that we had learned. So this is super explicitly, clearly talking about how they develop. So they develop in getting to hear the new language from me first, and I teach it to them explicitly. They practice it by reciting it back to me. They have to say the word that they have, and they use it by getting up and sorting that word in the game that they're playing. So talk about those 3 different things. Talk about how they develop, practice, and use vocab. So this is not one or the other. You have to talk about all of them. Okay. And then the last bit, describe how you plan to support the children during and or prior to the learning experience and develop and use the key vocabulary identified in prompt 4A. So you listed off all the vocabulary. Now you have to talk about how you are going to support the children, both before and after. So a really good option here, so this is talk about your supports for the whole group. Talk about your supports for individual students. Describe how you plan to support the children. I'm going to go back here and just see if this is one of those IEP ones. candidate plans specific vocabulary supports in relation to the children's language needs to engage them in the learning experience, describes how vocabulary supports are specific for some children in the whole group or class. You do not have to talk about your IEPs, but you probably should here. So that would get you up to a level 4. So some ideas for supports: pre-teaching vocabulary, and that's why they said during and or prior to learning experience. So I feel like that's, a major hint there. So pre-teach the vocabulary, model vocabulary use, let them try it to practice. So this is the gradual release of responsibility, the I do, we do, you do, which, by the way, is another really good thing to include in your planned support section up here. Go back to 3B and work in gradual release of responsibility, which is Fisher and Fry, because everybody at NAS has learned about the gradual release of responsibility, also known as I do, we do, you do. Okay, I'm getting distracted. So some more ideas for supports: pre-teaching vocabulary, modeling, letting them try, allowing them to use the words in a supported environment, reading books with the newly learned words. I'm just going to put etc. There's loads of others that you can find, and I would say talk about the ones that are appropriate for whole group here and the ones that are appropriate for specific students here, and be very specific. Describe the support in detail, and if you connect to the related needs of the children, you can get yourself up to a level 5. The candidate explains how vocabulary supports are either designed or differentiated to meet the needs of all children who have differing language needs. Go beyond the superficial for your differentiated support. So that is a potential area that you could get a 5 on this one. Okay, the last rubric is planning assessments to monitor and support the children's learning. So how do your informal and formal assessments monitor children's multimodal learning of language and literacy? And this is all related to prompt 5. So part A, describe how your planned formal and informal assessments provide direct evidence to monitor children's multimodal learning throughout the learning segment. So this is literally in lesson 1, I assess students' understanding of multimodal learning through or by, and then explain your informal and formal assessments. You don't need both. You need to just have across your 3 lessons at least one informal and at least one formal assessment, and every lesson needs at least one. So then in lesson 2, do the same exact thing. And then, you guessed it, in lesson 3, what do you do? So you're actually just going to list the assessments that you are giving. And the key here is that you must have them throughout your learning segment. It's not enough to just talk about the ending assessment. You have to talk about how you are frequently checking in with your students. Okay. And then explain your assessments. What's good to add here is how do they provide you direct evidence? So in lesson 1, I assess the students by this. This provides me with direct evidence of their learning by, and then here, describe the evidence. And do that with all of them again. So first you describe them, and then you explain how it provides you with direct evidence. So for example, if you use a rubric to assess their writing on the final day, step 1 is explain your rubric. So in order to assess their multimodal learning of writing, I give them a formal rubric at the end of lesson 3. This rubric contains the following criteria, and then you would list out the criteria that are included. Things like their ability to use descriptive language, the number of words they use, the kind of descriptive words they use. Are they using the 5 senses? That would be a good final assessment. It provides you with direct evidence of their learning by matching up their mastery of their ability to write to the criteria in the rubric. So I know that if students get a 3 out of 3 on providing a descriptive word, then I know that they're able to do that. So the evidence is they earn a 3 on their writing sample, and my rubric tells me that they have mastered that. So you need to be super explicit and clear in how all of your assessments provide evidence of learning and at multiple points. So I think lesson by lesson is the best way. And then finally, how are you adapting your planned assessments to allow children with specific needs to demonstrate their learning? This is one of those have to write about your IEPs and 504s, and this is really just how are you modifying not the activity. Talk about only the assessments planned here, not activities or tasks. So people sometimes get confused on this one, and they start saying things like, I'm going to, I'm going to differentiate the way I pre-teach the vocabulary, and some kids will have pictures and others are going to have, they can listen to the word, and others are going to have their personal vocabulary charts that they can look at. Not here. That was in how your plan supports in your lessons when this is about assessment. So an example of this, if you've got a writing assessment and you have students in your class who are not fully capable of writing yet, do you have an alternative way to assess them? Or do you have something like a sentence starter or a sentence frame that gives them some language to follow around the writing task that you're assigning? How are you going to support them? And these are all your good differentiation strategies. Talk about IEPs and 504s. That's a must. And anyone else in the context for learning. So you got to refer back to that context for learning at multiple points in your edTPA. And if you have planned supports that provide evidence from more than one modality of children's learning of language and literacy at various points in the learning segment, you'll be at a level 3. So that's another thing here. Make sure you're connecting to the multimodal learning. So explicitly talk about how your assessments are multimodal. So in this lesson, maybe they're doing it orally. In the next lesson, maybe they're doing it physically. And in the final lesson, maybe they're doing it in writing. So that's another way you can differentiate. If your assessments gather evidence of learning related to the central focus, and they may be formative, summative, or both, you'll be at a level 3. So again, that informal and the formal assessment at multiple points. Evidence that is yielded by the assessments, the evidence that you get, both formative and summative, is explained, and the determination of how the candidates will be able to monitor the learning is not left up to the scorer. So that is that specific evidence. So again, this rubric will provide me with a score out of 9 possible points. Let's say you have 3 levels and they're all worth 3. The highest score a student can get is 9. I am expecting students to get at least a 6 out of 9 to show me that they've mastered this objective of mine. So you have to clearly talk about how you're going to be able to monitor your children's learning. So it's not enough to just say, I planned a rubric, or I'm going to use a checklist, or I'm going to use an exit ticket, or I'm going to give them a quiz. It's not enough. You have to say how you're going to directly use that evidence in order to decide who succeeded and who has not. And that's the best way to do it, is to set, like, I used a rubric, the highest score is a 9 out of 9, and I'm expecting at least a 6 out of 9. You must identify the learning that they plan to assess and how you plan to assess it. So during the discussion on the differences between facts and opinions, I will note on a checklist who is able to state an opinion and use complete sentences. So a checklist. If you've got a lesson plan in task 1 that does not have an assessment, I highly recommend that you use a checklist of some sort. But your objectives, if you wrote your objectives in School of Ed style, they are all set to a level of criteria for your expectations. That's where you can align your assessment. And then, of course, you have to align to your IEP or 504 plans and explicitly address that in your commentary and in your artifacts. That's your lesson plans. List of assessment requirements or accommodations is not sufficient by itself. Okay, so that is how you can get a 3 on the final set of questions. Okay, a lot of information, a lot of details, but you've now gone through the entire task 1 planning commentary with what to write for each one, some examples throughout, and how you can score at least a 3 on the rubric. And I hope this was helpful.